Joined here by Patrick Orecki from Citizens Budget Commission. Thanks so much for doing this. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's start with your perception of where things are now. And the New York State budget, of course, it was passed in May, but now we have the reconciliation plan that's been passed and signed by Donald Trump on July 4th. Where does that put New York State at this point?
Yeah, it does throw a wrench into some of the state's budget plans. Obviously, we knew when the budget passed in May that something was coming from Washington. The size, the scope of it, we didn't know, but now we have a clearer picture, and it's going to be multi-billion-dollar impacts to the state over time.
I know that even before the reconciliation plan was passed, you had takeaways, if you will, from the New York State budget process. What were some of those, and how does that impact things moving forward?
Yeah, our read of the budget in general was that it spent too much and prepared too little. I mean, we didn't know exactly what form these cuts from Washington were going to take, but they were coming. So we wanted the state to set aside some money to ease the initial impacts that we're seeing now, but the state does have some holes to fill.
You look at, I think one thing you did look at was spending and why that's up. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, spending is up really across the board. You know, the things that really drive the state's spending growth every year are the Medicaid program and school aid spending. Between those two, you have well over half of the state budget. So when those grow fast, which they are right now, the whole budget grows fast. And we see one of the fastest rates of growth in recent history.
And some of that also tied to receipts, tax receipts, things like that. Is that also maybe helps give lawmakers a green light to say, hey, we have more money to spend, so let's spend it? I guess, how does that all come into play?
Yeah, you know, over the past few years, the state has really enjoyed a very, very strong receipts picture. We've taken in a lot of money. You know, keep in mind that inflation isn't bad for state tax receipts. In fact, it's good for sales tax receipts. And when Wall Street does well, New York State tax collections do well, which has largely been the case too.
And I believe there's also a federal funding aspect that has helped at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Up to this point.
Yep, from the American Rescue Plan in 2021 especially, but several federal packages gave the state a lot of money, which drove up spending too.
So you talk about those big pieces. I think we've talked about those before of the budget, Medicaid and school aid at the end of the day, education. Now that you have at least a framework to look at with the reconciliation plan passage, how does it impact those chunks of New York's budget and how much they spend on those things?
Yeah, I think the two biggest things to pay attention to are the timing aspects here. First of all, reconciliation package isn't the last thing that'll come from Washington. There's a regular federal budget to wait for in a couple months' time probably as well. So we need to be on the lookout for that. And the reconciliation bill, it's not like flicking on a switch and every impact is immediately felt by the state. These things will phase in over time. They have different effective dates. So it's really a ramp up to the full impact of the cuts.
I know that you believe that in the commission talked about at the time the budget was being talked about and worked on, that you probably at that time needed to account for this, right? Even if the pending cuts, is that right?
Yeah. We encourage the state to set aside at least $2 billion as sort of an initial cushion to deal with the mid-year impacts, and then take stock when you come back to make the budget again in January. So, you know, that's what we thought the state should do. I think they'll be able to probably get to next year's budget making without necessarily needing to come back and have an extraordinary session. But the problems are real and multiple billions of dollars in the future.
Because there's been talks about that special session now for the last 6 months or so, even while we had a lot of this conversation beginning. And I think people think, well, should they come now, or do you wait until now that you had the reconciliation plan, or do you wait until after? I think the governor has said we want to see what happens in the fall. You know, does it behoove the state to do it at one point or another? And then the other aspect is you have until after 2026 for these Medicaid changes to go through, right? I guess, how do you compartmentalize all of that?
Yeah, you're kind of balancing a few different things.
Yeah.
One is the urgency of actually dealing with the cuts, and the state probably has the authority to deal with them in the short term. But you also want everybody at the table to be talking about it. You don't want the governor to be having to make those decisions entirely unilaterally, so you want every lawmaker that you can get at the table to talk about it.
So how does the state handle this? I've heard some say, and the governor, I believe, said we need to look at our agencies and see where we can make things a little bit trimmer there. And then I've heard others say we need to look at ways we can raise revenue. What for you, is it maybe holistic?
Yeah, I think a multifaceted approach on the spending side is going to be what's justified. Obviously, the cuts from Washington directly are mostly in the Medicaid program, but I think the entire $254 billion state spending plan should be looked at to find areas where you can identify some savings.
Do you think revenue raising should be an option?
We think it should be avoided. Keep in mind that New York State and local governments have the highest per capita tax obligations of anywhere in the country. So you don't want to add, to those layers of taxation. We think it's something that the state, if it takes a close look at its spending, can find plenty of savings.
And I know long-term your analysis has shown that some of these deficits, some of these concerns only increase, right? What does that look like, in light of all of this?
Yeah, the budget always kind of is a multi-year document. And in the short term, we generally see balance and then gaps going into the future to deal with. Right now, those gaps that we see on paper are pretty significant, up to about $14 billion in 3 years' time. So we have challenges even before taking into account what the bottom line impact of the reconciliation bill is.
Patrick, thanks so much.
Thank you.